This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
KTBC Television News now presents a special program on today's mass murder in the capital city. Here is KTBC Television News Editor Neil Spells.
Good evening. One of history's worst mass murders occurred here in Austin today. By official count tonight, 49 persons were hit by gunfire. There are 16 dead and 33 injured. It started last night when a man reportedly killed his wife and his mother. That same man apparently rounded up an arsenal and supplies this morning and then went to the observation deck of the University of Texas Tower. It was then that terror rained down from the tower. Charles Ward was there and described the shooting.
There must have been a hit that last time. We hear people outside of our building in an area where we can't now look safely saying, let's help that boy. Does he need help? Someone must be down. Maybe an empty carton of shells. Ricochet bullets bouncing off the top of the tower. Piece of the tower falling now. And the battle goes on.
Sirens screamed for the 90 minutes that the gun battle was in progress. It was hot, past 90 degrees on the ground, probably much hotter, high atop the tower with the sun. Persons risked death time and time again to try to save them. One funeral director driving an ambulance was shot and critically injured trying to help. An Austin policeman lost his life. A University of Texas professor was killed. Countless students and innocent bystanders fell without knowing what hit them. A boy riding a bicycle was picked off with deadly accuracy. Time and time again, men risked their lives to try to save others, and this man shown here hauling a dead man to safety was one such man. Charles Ward talked with him after he got back.
One of those who is out of breath now after running out onto the mall rescuing those who've been shot is Brian Ellison of Austin, who's been in Vietnam and has been back for 2 years. Brian, how many have you gone out to rescue?
Today, 2.
What did you have to do?
Run hard and keep low.
Did you have any trouble getting them up, or did any shots come close to you while you were out there?
No shots came close to me. Just the last one. He was dead. He was dead weight. He was a little hard to pick up, too limp. Not like someone who's knocked out.
How many have you seen that are dead today?
Just one. I hope not anymore.
But there were more, many more, and the full impact of today's tragedy still has not been felt because the magnitude of the crime is practically impossible to comprehend.
The last few years in Texas have seen a parade of DNA exonerations. 45 men so far. The first ones were big news, but the print has grown smaller as Texans have watched a dismaying march of exonerees, their wasted years haunting the public conscience. But now a case in Williamson County, just north of Austin, is raising the ante. After being sentenced to life in prison for murdering his wife, Michael Morton was released last year when DNA testing proved he was not the killer. But instead of merely seeking financial compensation, Mr. Morton and his attorneys, including the Innocence Project, are accusing the district attorney in the case of deliberately withholding exculpatory evidence. Now, listeners should be advised this report contains graphic descriptions. Here's NPR's Wade Goodwin.
On the morning of April 13, 1986, Michael Morton was getting ready for work as head of the pharmacy department at a nearby Safeway store in Austin. He closed the door to his home, blissfully unaware that the next time he saw his wife of 7 years, she would be in a casket. Michael Morton had 9 hours of his previously normal life left. The clock ran out as he arrived to pick up his son from daycare after work.
First time I figured something was up was when I locked eyes with the babysitter. She looked at me real weird, like, "What are you doing here? Eric's not here. Why are you here?"
Michael was immediately worried and called home. The man who answered was Williamson County Sheriff Jim Boutwell. The sheriff refused to answer Morton's questions and told him to come home immediately. Morton drove there in a panic.
There were a lot of cars in the street. There was a big yellow crime scene ribbon around our house. Neighbors were across the street, clustered on the corner and the sidewalk looking over, and you can tell they're talking to each other. And, of course, when my truck comes racing up, they all kind of key on me.
Boutwell met Morton outside the front door and, in front of everyone, told him Christine was dead, murdered in their bedroom. Morton reeled.
You really don't know how you're going to react until it happens to you. And with me, I remember it was as if I was like falling inside myself.
Sheriff Boutwell took Morton into the living room, where for the next 4 hours, with his wife's body still down the hall, Morton answered every question the sheriff could think of and never once asked for a lawyer.
In my mind, I forget about how you feel about things, but in my mind I knew, okay, he's doing his job. You have to eliminate the suspects, so he's got to tick off these certain questions and get rid of me as a suspect and get on with this thing.
Morton was wrong. Boutwell had already decided that Michael was his number one suspect. The previous day had been Michael's birthday, and the Morton family had gone out for a nice dinner. After getting home and putting Eric to bed, Morton was hoping for a happy ending, with Christine. But that's not what happened, and Michael's feelings were a little hurt. So this is what he wrote the next morning before he left for work.
Chris, I know you didn't mean to, but you made me feel really unwanted last night. After a good meal, we came home, you binged on the rest of the cookies, then you farted and fell asleep. I'm not mad. I just wanted you to know how I feel without us getting into a fight about sex. Just think how you'd feel if you were left hanging on your birthday. I love you, Michael.
This note left on the couple's bathroom mirror turned out to be Michael Morton's doom. Williamson County District Attorney Ken Anderson used it to weave a sensational tale of unspeakable violence. In Anderson's version of the crime, Morton used a wooden club to viciously bludgeon his wife's head because she wouldn't have sex with him. Then, in triumph over her body, he pleasured himself. The mild-mannered grocery store manager was transformed into a sexually sick, murderous psychopath. It was all a prosecutorial fantasy. None of it was true. But Anderson pounded his fists into his hands and wept to the jury as he described Morton's perversity. Compared to this vivid picture of the crime, Morton's defense didn't have a lot to offer. Bill Allison is a criminal law professor at the University of Texas, but in 1986, he was Michael Morton's lawyer.
The defense was that Michael didn't do it, and we don't know who did it, but whoever did it snuck in and committed a really vicious murder. And that is very frightening. A jury, by convicting Michael, makes themselves safe. They've solved the case, and they can go on about their business.
But what the jury didn't know, what the defense lawyers didn't know, in fact, what nobody but the sheriff's office and the district attorney knew about, was the evidence that was being concealed by Williamson County law enforcement.
There were fingerprints on the sliding glass door, and there were fingerprints on the luggage that was piled on Christine Morton's body.
For the last 8 years, John Raley of Houston's Raley and Bowick has spent thousands of hours pro bono as Michael Morton's lawyer. Raley says there were unknown fingerprints, a man's, on the sliding glass door at the back of the house, and on a suitcase that was thrown on top of Christine's head after she was murdered. And that's not all. A neighbor told police that she'd seen a man in a green van casing the Morton home repeatedly.
The neighbors report that they had seen a strange van driving around the neighborhood, stopping around the Morton house. The man in the van would drive around back to the wooded area and walk into the wooded area and back. The interesting thing is it's around that area where the bandana that contains the DNA was eventually found.
A bloody bandana was found by a deputy behind the Morton home, but incredibly, the sheriff's office decided to ignore it and left it lying on the ground. Morton's lawyer, John Raley, says the evidence trail got even hotter.
On August 15, 1986, the Williamson County Sheriff's Office was contacted by San Antonio Police regarding an attempted use of Christine's credit card at a place called the Jewel Box in San Antonio, Texas. It was used under fraudulent circumstances.
This information should have had Williamson County investigators scrambling to San Antonio. After all, Christine Morton's purse had been stolen. This was possible evidence of capital murder, since murdering in the commission of another crime brings the possibility of the death penalty. But the Williamson County Sheriff's Department never even bothered to return the San Antonio Police Department's call. In a note found 25 years later in the sheriff's file, a deputy mocked the tip, writing, "Course we know better." This determined avoidance of inconvenient evidence was complete the next day when Eric, who was almost 4, privately told Christine's mother what happened that morning of the murder. Eric told his grandmother that a monster came into the house. The monster was big and angry, that he hurt Mommy, that Mommy was crying.
And described it in vivid detail. And then he said, "Mommy, stop crying. Wake up, Mommy." And he said, "The monster's mad." He put a suitcase on Mommy, a blue suitcase, which is, of course, exactly the way they found her.
Shaken, Rita Kirkpatrick asked Eric if his daddy had been there when this happened. The boy replied, quote, "No, just Mommy and Eric was there." Kirkpatrick believed her grandson completely. His details were horrifyingly accurate. She called the sheriff's department about her conversation and told them, "You need to get off this domestic violence thing. There is a monster out there." But the deputy told Christine's mother not to tell anyone else about her conversation with Eric and to keep Eric quiet too. From the tip about the credit card to the man in the green van behind the Morton house to Eric's eyewitness account of his mother's murder, all of this evidence was withheld from both the judge in the case and defense attorneys. And so Michael Morton didn't get to see Eric grow up. When Eric was 12, he stopped seeing his father in prison, and when Eric was 18, he changed his last name from Morton. That broke his father's spirit. 14 years into a life sentence, Michael Morton hit absolute bottom.
The things that I was hanging on to in the world, and he was it. When that was gone, I just cratered. When you are completely without hope, when you are completely without any avenue of escape, when you're not sure of any reason to go on, I cried out to God. I said, "Okay, I'm done. I got nothing."
So how was Michael Morton finally freed? Remember the bloody bandana that was left lying behind the Morton house? Well, Christine's brother found it later that day, and he turned it in. For years, Williamson County fought Morton's request to have the evidence in his case tested. Prosecutors ridiculed his efforts and taunted him, saying they'd consider DNA testing the evidence only if Morton would first take responsibility for his crime. It was when a Texas appeals court finally ordered the bandana DNA tested last year that law enforcement's arrogance was blown to pieces. After remaining silent for months, former Williamson County District Attorney Ken Anderson, now a state judge, held a press conference.
As district attorney at the time, and as woefully inadequate as I realize it is, I want to formally apologize for the system's failure to Mr. Morton and to every other person who was adversely affected by this verdict.
Christine's blood was found on that bandana and that of another man, Mark Allen Norwood. Norwood has a long criminal record, including assault. The other bombshell occurred when the appeals court ordered the DA's and sheriff's files opened completely. The exculpatory evidence found there stunned Texas legal circles. Anderson says he's not to blame.
There have been a number of allegations made about professional conduct by the prosecutors, including me, in this case. In my heart, I know there was no misconduct whatsoever.
For one thing, Anderson's lawyer, Eric Nichols, disputes the newly discovered evidence would have made any difference to the jury if they had known. He also claims there was no duty for Anderson to disclose the evidence either to the judge or defense attorneys.
The plain fact of the matter is, though, that the law in 1986 and 1987 did not require that the reports themselves be disclosed. And Judge Anderson has testified that these are the types of things that he would routinely discuss with defense counsel, even though there was no legal requirement to turn over those reports.
Anderson is not claiming that he did, in fact, reveal this evidence. His official position is that he can't remember. After Mark Allen Norwood's DNA was identified on the bandana, Innocence Project staff began looking for other murders like Christine's in Austin, and they found one. A little more than a year after Christine was murdered in a nearby neighborhood, another young Austin mother, Deborah Baker, was also savagely bludgeoned in her home with a wooden club. Austin police then compared the stored DNA found at Deborah Baker's murder scene to Norwood's DNA, and it matched. In 1988, Deborah Baker left behind a grieving husband and not one but two little children. 23 years later, Philip Baker and their grown children are trying to come to grips with the new and unhappy thought that their wife and mother didn't have to die after all.
We all got pretty angry when we began to discover that they probably could have found this guy in '86 had they looked. But instead, Ken Anderson simply focused on Mike Morton. We're all extremely angry at him.
Bound together by their wives' murders, their alleged killer, and the disastrous fallout from the Williamson County investigation, Philip Baker and Michael Morton have become colleagues. For the last 24 years, Philip Baker considered himself terribly unlucky. His wife was murdered, and the murderer got away. Now he knows better.
I stand next to Mike up in that courtroom. I told him, I said, you know, your exoneration was the first time it ever dawned on me that I could have been the one they arrested.
Baker's faith is shaken. Michael Morton, on the other hand, is further down the road. He's had 25 years in prison to get perspective on then District Attorney, now State Judge Ken Anderson.
I don't want his head on a stick. I don't want him to go to prison forever and a day. What I want to do is do what I can to see that this doesn't happen to anybody else.
At Morton's request, the Texas Supreme Court has appointed a court of inquiry to investigate whether the former district attorney broke the law when he allegedly withheld exculpatory evidence. But beyond Anderson's fate, Michael Morton wants new Texas legislation. If a Texas district attorney is found to have withheld exculpatory evidence in a case, that prosecutor would be subject to a stiff fine and loss of law license. Morton believes that simple step would solve the problem, that no prosecutor would suppress evidence to put a suspect in prison if it meant not only risking his job, but his livelihood if he were caught. Wade Goodwin, NPR News, Dallas.
In Michael Morton's darkest moments, he says he had an intense emotional experience, and you can hear about it on our website, npr.org.
And I'm sure, like, the first thing that people will think is, what the hell can Michael Morton's conviction have to do with Adam Walsh? Well, Michael Morton's case takes place in Williamson County, and the sheriff there was a guy named Jim Boutwell. And Jim Boutwell, he was originally part of the whole Charles Whitman shooting. He was a reserve deputy at that time, it's down near Austin. He was in Williamson County, but he had access to an airplane. So he went up and he was able to take part in the recon on trying to get Charles Whitman out of the tower. Williamson County has been the source of, like, one of the worst histories of Texas's criminal justice problem. And you can go and, you can start Googling now, but that story is like the tip of the iceberg. Then you have to say, well, what the hell does Adam Walsh have to do with Jim Boutwell and Texas? Well, a couple of things. First of all, Jim Boutwell, in April of 1983, is the guy responsible for parading Henry Lee Lucas around the world. And then you've got another interesting policeman who enters the mix. His name is Buddy Terry. Buddy Terry comes over, and he calls back to say that he's talked to Henry Lee Lucas and cleared 8 Florida cases. So Buddy Terry gets it in his head that Jim Boutwell has caught Henry Lee Lucas, so he can't jump on that super cop train. But what he can do is he can solve the Adam Walsh case, and he can jump on that super cop train, and he can get himself a book deal, and he can start appearing on television, and he can retire in a way that provides him a lot of money and a lot of power. So that's what Buddy Terry decides he's going to do. He goes back after talking to Lucas, and he concocts a plan where Otis Toole is going to confess to the Adam Walsh case. And the thing about Otis is, yeah, he's going to confess to the Adam Walsh case. Adam Walsh is the tip of the iceberg with these guys. It's a huge case. It's the one that, like, they make the most promises to Otis Toole on. And then you get other criminals involved. And by other criminals, I'm not talking about Otis and Henry being the first criminal. So I'm talking about Buddy Terry being the first criminal. The other criminals that get involved are Gerard Schaefer and a couple of other inmates. And what ultimately happens there is Otis will confess to it. Otis will confess to whatever they want him to confess to. As long as he's not abused and people treat him nicely, he does not give 2 shits. He will just confess. But the thing is, you've got to give him the information so that he can confess accurately. And that's what they're calling confessing, recanting, confessing, recanting. It's that Otis doesn't know enough to tell the investigators what happened because he didn't kill Adam Walsh.
From Medium.com by K.M. Brown, The Crimes and Misdemeanors of Sheriff Jim Boutwell. What is evil but good tortured by its own hunger and thirst? Verily, when good is hungry, it seeks food, even in dark caves. And when it thirsts, it drinks, even of dead waters. On Good and Evil and the Prophet, by Khalil Gibran. The Orlando Sentinel describes Jim Boutwell in his 1993 obituary as the legendary Texas lawman who tried to shoot down sniper Charles Whitman from the University of Texas bell tower in 1966. According to the obit, Boutwell was then a reserve deputy and owner of a local airport. When Whitman started shooting people from the top of the bell tower, Boutwell took to his small plane and buzzed the bell tower, exchanging gunfire with Whitman and allowing people to escape. He sounds bigger than life, doesn't he? And after the UT Tower shooting, he was. There's no question that taking a small plane within the firing range of a mentally unbalanced gunman takes guts. People respected that, and the event established Boutwell as a risk-taker who'd do whatever he needed to do to get his man, and in the process, he would destroy more lives than he saved. The incident on the UT Tower wasn't the first time that Boutwell had combined his skill as a pilot with his love for law enforcement. In 1948, as a Department of Public Safety radio operator technician, Boutwell had rented a surplus PT-22 to assist in apprehending an arsonist who was setting brush fires in the hills west of Austin. Boutwell relied on his DPS connection and his interest in aviation again in 1949 when he learned that a convicted felon had escaped from the Jordanton, Texas jail. Boutwell contacted local aviation pioneer Bobby Ragsdale, who picked Boutwell up in his plane and headed for the woods where the convict was believed to be making his way toward Mexico. Ragsdale piloted the plane while Boutwell stayed in contact with the Texas Rangers via radio, guiding them toward their prey. A shootout followed and ended with the escapees' surrender. Aviation was a promising new field at the time, and Bobby Ragsdale was a significant influence in promoting the use of aircraft for law enforcement. Boutwell, in the meantime, set his sights in a different direction, on the development of an airport and flight school. To that end, he leased 20 acres from Theodore Timmerman shortly after Timmerman purchased a 250-acre plot in 1956. He held the airfield only briefly before giving it up to Timmerman's son, Ted Jr., after taking a job with Champion Aircraft Corporation. It seems that he held on to his dreams of a flying school for at least another decade, though, or perhaps his ambitions were revived in 1966 after the UT shooting. This incident, more than any other, came to define Boutwell's life, but the facts surrounding his participation in it are muddy. On August 1st, 1966, Charles Whitman made his way to the top of the University of Texas tower observation deck carrying multiple firearms. Once there, he began randomly firing at people below. Law enforcement officers and armed civilians surrounded the tower and worked to put an end to the carnage. Police Lieutenant Marion Lee, reporting from a small airplane, noted that there was a single sniper firing from the observation deck. The airplane circled the tower while Lee tried to shoot Whitman, but turbulence made it difficult for him to get a clear shot. The airplane, piloted by Jim Boutwell, was hit by Whitman's rifle fire, but continued to circle the tower from a safe distance until the end of the incident. That image of Boutwell carrying a law officer and circling at a safe distance has a different tone than the Orlando Sentinel's description of airport owner Jim Boutwell buzzing the tower while he exchanged gunfire with the shooter. Maybe Boutwell wasn't the one shooting. Maybe he wasn't the owner of an airport. Maybe it wasn't his plane. TowerShooting.com, a website with a mission to provide a factual base for journalists, historians, and researchers interested in the event, identifies the plane's owner as Marvin Childress. According to this site, Childress was on board, along with Boutwell, a civilian pilot, and the APD Lieutenant Marion Lee. Although TowerShooting.com doesn't credit the plane's occupants with saving lives, it does acknowledge their role in keeping on-ground law enforcement advised via radio about the shooter's position. They needed all the help they could get. Before the shooting spree from the UT observation deck was over, Whitman had killed or fatally wounded 17 people and non-fatally wounded 31 others, and however large or small his role was in the incident, Boutwell was a star. The Orlando Sentinel is likely exaggerating the facts in its description of Boutwell engaging in gunfire with Whitman while buzzing the UT tower. The gunman he was carrying, Marion Lee, may not have been able to fire off a shot, and he wasn't flying the plane. But the Orlando Sentinel wasn't the only source guilty of hyperbole when it came to Boutwell. After the tower incident, he started frequently being described as a legend and bigger than life. He started living a bigger life too. In 1967, he spoke to the United States Senate as a representative of the Action Committee for Veterans Flight Training and identified himself as the president of Aviation Training Centers, Incorporated, of Austin, Texas. Boutwell described the Action Committee as a national organization of individuals who are working to establish eligibility for VA benefits for aviation training schools. Boutwell told senators that he'd been engaged with the field of aviation for many years as a DPS pilot, and at the time of his appearance as the president of an aviation company employing a fair number of people, I was unable to corroborate those claims. The history of DPS pilots doesn't mention Boutwell on their website, although it does name the two men who were employed in that capacity by the DPS between 1953 and 1967, including the year of Boutwell's testimony. By the time he spoke before the committee, the airfield he had leased from Timmerman had long been under the control of Timmerman's son and was being operated as Timms Field. Boutwell apparently still had an interest in Aviation Training Centers Incorporated, which was based at Timms Field, as he is reported to have sold it in January of 1968. In the next record of his activity, he'd left the aviation industry and became the sheriff of Williamson County, Texas. Not much was known about the effects of celebrity when Donna Rockwell and David Giles began exploring the topic by examining the inner lives of 15 famous people. Their subjects were selected across a wide spectrum, reflective of American culture, including sports, entertainment, television, news, and government. The researchers found that after fame, life is never the same. When people become famous, even within their own local or career circles, the nature of their relationship with others is forever changed. Suddenly, the celebrities don't know who to trust. Do others want to be near them for who they really are? Or are they only sought out so that others may bask in the light of their fame? In order to deal with the intense attention, many celebrities report creating two selves. One, an image to offer to the public, and the other reserved for moments of privacy and intimacy. The famous person creates a celebrity self, an other self, to emotionally survive the experience of being famous. The rules as they are written for the rest of us don't apply to the celebrity. He or she is measured by a different set of standards created around the perceived needs of the public. Since fame depends on ongoing attention and adoration, The public may be experienced as a celebrity's boss, a boss that must be satisfied in order for stardom to continue. And continue it must, for there is an addictive quality to fame. The lure of adoration is attractive, and it becomes difficult for the person to imagine living without the fame. One participant said, "It is somewhat of a high," and another, "I kind of get off on it." One said, "I've been addicted to almost every substance known to man at one point or another, and the most addicting of them all is fame." Where does the celebrity go when fame passes? Having become dependent on fame, how does one adjust to being less famous over time? "As the sun sets on my fame," one celebrity said, "I'm going to have to learn how to put it in its proper place." But what if the sun never has to set? In order to keep a legend going, bigger-than-life lawmen need bigger-than-life criminals. Jim Boutwell had found such a criminal in Charles Whitman. In 1983, as sheriff of Williamson County, Texas, he found another. Henry Lee Lucas had been arrested by Texas Ranger Phil Ryan for the murders of his girlfriend, 15-year-old Frida Lorraine Powell, and an elderly woman, Kate Rich. He'd already served time for one murder. In 1960, at the age of 24, Lucas had killed his mother. He'd been sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison for the crime, but was released after only 10 due to prison overcrowding. Interestingly, Charles Whitman's first murders were also those closest to him, his mother and his wife. He'd killed them both before carrying his weapons to the top of the UT Tower. Looking back, the random spray of bullets that followed feels like a sinister foreshadowing of what was to come in the saga of Henry Lee Lucas. At the Rich arraignment, the judge asked Lucas if he understood that he was being charged with Rich's death. Lucas said that he did. Then, without warning or provocation, he asked the judge what he was going to do about the other 100 women he'd killed. That was the beginning of the media and law enforcement snafu that Ryan would refer to in the Netflix documentary, The Confession Killer, as a circus that would not leave town. Immediately, calls started coming in to Ryan from law officers all around the country. They wanted to know if Lucas's blanket confession might help them solve their own open cases. Ryan worked with Lucas to gather information, sitting with him for hours as he drew pictures of his victims and recalled endless details about their murders. Whenever the narratives his prisoner gave him seemed to match up with unsolved crimes, Ryan would contact the sheriff for that jurisdiction and relay the information. One of those whom he contacted was Sheriff Jim Boutwell of Williamson County. Boutwell had been unsuccessfully investigating a number of murders along Interstate 35 that he believed were the work of a serial killer. After Ryan's call, he obtained a bench warrant and picked Lucas up, then brought him to his own jail. And then from that point on, Ryan recalls, as he tells the story to the documentarians, "You never saw Henry without Boutwell." Boutwell may have craved the spotlight, but Ryan was weary of it. When Boutwell usurped the role of intermediary between Lucas and law enforcement officers, Ryan seems to have relinquished it without protest. "I was ready for some fence cutting and some goat stealing," he says. But Boutwell envisioned something bigger. He went to James B. Adams, the director of the Texas Department of Public Safety and the head of the Texas Rangers, with a request to set up a task force for the purpose of processing Lucas's confessions. The task force was assembled and headed up by Bob Prince, a Texas Ranger. For over a year, the group worked through a nationwide backlog of unsolved murders. Lucas increased his estimate of the number of murders he'd committed from the 100 he'd mentioned at the Rich arraignment upwards to 150, then 300, then 600. When it comes to describing his alleged crimes, Lucas didn't stop at the believable. He bragged of murdering in every possible way. He said he was Seattle's Green River Killer, Jimmy Hoffa's assassin, and the man who supplied the poison to Jim Jones for his massacre in Guyana. He told Japanese filmmakers who visited him in prison that he had committed some murders in their country too. When questioned about how he got to Japan, Lucas responded that he drove. That didn't seem to matter. Neither the facts nor the outlandish nature of Lucas's claims could deter Boutwell from his quest to expose his confession giver to as many law enforcement officers and as much publicity as possible. In return for cooperating with investigators, Boutwell allowed Lucas extra privileges, regular contact with his spiritual advisor, a good bit of free time unshackled outside of his cell, a TV, and a milkshake for every murderer whose life he claimed to have taken. Other people started noticing the absurdity of the situation, even if Boutwell didn't. Journalist Hugh Ainsworth was one of those. As the author of a book about serial killer Ted Bundy, Ainsworth was the sort of celebrity Boutwell might have hoped to rub shoulders with. As such, he was given open access to Henry Lee Lucas. He came and went in the jail as he wished and interviewed Lucas at length. He described the work of the task force as consisting of the provision of 20-minute slots made available to law officers from across the country. The officers would talk with Lucas, feeding him facts about their cases that should have been withheld for trial. Lucas would then confess to the murders, and the task force members would stick a pin in a U.S. map they had hanging on the wall to mark the location. The officers would then close their cases and notify the next of kin. Ainsworth quickly determined that the zigzagging pattern that emerged on the map would have been impossible for Lucas and his accomplice to have driven in real life. It would have involved constant movement without stops for food or gas. Aside from the logistics, Ainsworth had another reason to doubt. Lucas had started telling him that the stories he'd been creating were just that, stories. It's likely he might have been guilty of the 3 murders he'd been arrested for before his confabulated confession mill began, but that was the extent of any of his reign of terror. Ainsworth checked out Lucas's alibis and easily collected proof of his innocence in Boutwell's original case, the murder of a young woman called by the nickname Orange Socks because her identity was not known. But Boutwell didn't want to hear it. Instead of delving into the evidence Ainsworth had collected, he responded by limiting his access to the prisoner instead. Ainsworth wasn't the only one to see the hoax for what it was. Dallas homicide detective Linda Irwin had been given some of Lucas's sketches and notes, alleged to be relevant to murders he committed within her jurisdiction. She wanted to question him and was invited by the task force to the Williamson County Jail. She was advised to bring Lucas a carton of Pall Mall cigarettes and was assured that in return, Lucas would tell her what she, quote, needed to know, unquote. Irwin arrived with the smokes as agreed and listened while Lucas described 10 murders he'd committed around Dallas. His confessions were not a match to the details of any of the open cases she was investigating. She knew he was lying. When she returned to the office and gave her supervisors the disappointing news, they decided to put together a murder case file for an imaginary person and see if Lucas might take the bait. On her next visit to see him, she left this totally bogus murder file containing bogus forensic reports and bogus crime scene photographs within his reach. He shuffled through the file and presented a totally bogus story of his own, relating details about the way he'd broken into the house, stabbed the occupant, and disposed of the body. In the documentary, Irwin doesn't come right out and say she believed that Boutwell and his task force were knowing participants in the fraud, but she didn't tell the Texas Rangers about her experiment either, presumably for just that reason. Instead, she went back to work on her open cases and predicted to her supervisors that this is all going to come crashing down. The damage caused by the task force scam went way beyond the false convictions. Lucas had already forfeited his life. He had little to lose with his confessions, but every case he claimed as his own left a killer at large to kill again. Irwin was right when she said that Boutwell's house of cards would all come crashing down. It did eventually, but not before another life was taken. Waco District Attorney Vic Feazell refused to accept Lucas's confessions in his open cases. He lacked Irwin's circumspection, though, and didn't follow her lead by confining his doubts to a trusted circle of colleagues. That was heroic, it was honest, but there was a risk to going against Boutwell's celebrity and the untouchable Texas Rangers. They took their orders from Adams, a retired FBI agent who'd previously served as the agency's acting and then its associate director. The Netflix docuseries suggests that Adams may have picked up some of director J. Edgar Hoover's unethical surveillance tactics, including warrantless wiretaps and false indictments. They retaliated against Feazell by poisoning his dog, filing false charges against him, arresting him, and conspiring with a local TV station to discredit him. He was eventually exonerated of all wrongdoing, but before that happened, he lost the life that he built. It wasn't taken by Henry Lee Lucas. It was destroyed by the Texas Rangers. Confession Killer is chilling to watch. It's a clear depiction of the abuse of power, of the helplessness of innocent citizens who are attacked by those in authority, of the authorities who close ranks against the powerless. The evidence that Lucas did not kill most of his proclaimed victims is insurmountable. It's beyond question. Yet task force member Bob Prince still clings to Lucas's discredited stories, and others who benefited from closing their cases based on Lucas's confessions refuse to reopen them and subject them to the scrutiny of clearer eyes and new technologies. They're all invested in the lies. Vic Feazell's case and Hugh Ainsworth's story in the Dallas Herald in 1986 finally drew the attention of Attorney General Jim Maddox. In May, Maddox issued a special report on the Lucas confessions, saying that the Rangers had done nothing to bring an end to the hoax. He called the claim that Lucas had committed the murders he'd confessed to highly unlikely, and noted that the officers who'd taken advantage of the fraud to justify closing their cases were guilty of a miscarriage of justice. They had just been taken for a ride. Boutwell wasn't mentioned by name in Maddox's report, and it's likely that the findings had little impact on him. If he was bothered at all, it was not for long. He'd just landed his next starring role. Christine Morton had been bludgeoned to death in her home, and the legendary lawman was on the killer's trail. In a brilliant two-part telling of the story, journalist Pamela Orloff describes Boutwell in the way he's often described, as larger than life to his followers. She generously recalls his role in the Texas Tower shooting, saying that he distracted Whitman as officers on the ground moved in. It's almost as if Boutwell can't be mentioned without providing the Tower event as a context. In 1986, almost 20 years to the day after the Tower tragedy, Boutwell was waiting at the Morton home when Christine's husband Michael arrived home from work. Boutwell read Morton his Miranda rights and began questioning. It didn't really matter what the answers were, though. Boutwell had already made up his mind. Morton was the killer, and Boutwell would do whatever he had to do to see him convicted of the crime. Boutwell had formed his opinion based on a note Morton had left his wife before going to work that day. In it, he'd expressed disappointment that she hadn't been in the mood for sex when the couple had returned home from an enjoyable dinner together. It was his birthday. He'd expected more. And in Boutwell's imagination of the events that followed, Morton had beat his wife to death in retaliation and then masturbated over her dead body. Then he'd gone to work, leaving his 3-year-old son at home alone with his mother's body. There are plenty of facts that conflicted with Boutwell's story, just as there had been in those he'd co-authored with Henry Lee Lucas. Neighbors had seen a green van in the neighborhood, and they'd watched while a man got out of it and wandered through a weedy area behind the Mortons' privacy fence. Boutwell reassured the neighbors and let them know they didn't have to worry about a killer in a green van. The sheriff had already identified the perpetrator. Fingerprints taken from the scene couldn't all be linked to members of the Morton household. Several of them, including one taken directly from Christine's body, could not be accounted for. They were disregarded. Footprints were found outside the Mortons' yard. Boutwell told reporters that they had nothing to do with the case. A blood-stained bandana was found behind the house by Christine's brother. He turned it over to police who didn't bother searching the area, either before or after the bandana was found. Boutwell later claimed it was from a construction accident. Eric, the Morton's 3-year-old son, told his grandmother about a monster who had attacked his mother. He said his father had not been home at the time. The investigators suggested that Michael must have been dressed in his scuba diving gear, and so had appeared to be a monster. A check made out to Christine was cashed after her death, and a man tried to use her credit card in San Antonio. The check and the credit card had been in her purse, stolen at the time of the murder. Prosecutors told the jury that the purse and one of Michael's guns, purported to also be missing, had been disposed of by him on his way to work on the morning of the murder. There was no mention of the check or the credit card at the trial. Although Boutwell played an outsized role in the case, Sergeant Don Wood was the lead investigator. Rather than following up on his many leads, he devoted his time to gathering evidence against Michael by interviewing the couple's friends and acquaintances instead. Holly Gursky, who spent days on end being interrogated at the sheriff's office, was deeply shaken. The whole time, I kept insisting that Mike could never have hurt Chris. I told them that. He was incapable of abandoning Eric. One morning, Sheriff Boutwell sat me down. He didn't raise his voice. He was to the point, but he had a very big, intimidating presence. And he said, "You're either lying or there's something you're not telling us." Using tactics such as this, Boutwell and Wood scraped together a picture of a troubled marriage from friends who recalled hearing the couple argue or Michael speaking harshly to Christine. After his interviews, Wood would write out longhand summaries of his conversations with the couple's friends. He'd later review them with Boutwell before typing them up. When the two men thought they had enough to make a case that would stick, they arrived at Morton's front door and arrested him, leading him away in handcuffs, while Eric, quickly passed off to a neighbor, screamed for his father. Ken Anderson, the Williamson County District Attorney, took it from there. There wasn't any physical evidence in the case. Michael had passed 2 lie detector tests, and he and his lawyers thought he had a very good chance of beating the charge. Oddly, Wood didn't even testify at the trial. Boutwell was called instead. He held his flimsy 3 pages of notes and under questioning stuck to his guns. Morton, he told the jury, had killed his wife. Boutwell concocted a convincing story of a husband enraged after being sexually rebuffed. Morton had rented an adult film the day before his birthday, and the judge allowed prosecutors to play part of it for the jury. As a result, some developed an impression of Morton as a sexually frustrated deviant. Semen found on the sheets seemed to corroborate Boutwell's story of a husband spurned and avenged masturbating over his wife's dead body. Nothing like that ever really happened, but it would take 25 years and the aid of the Innocence Project to clear Michael Morton's name. By then, Christine's real murderer, who hadn't been pursued, would have killed another young woman in a nearby town, and another 3-year-old child would be left without a mother. Boutwell would be dead. His glowing obituary describing him as a legendary Texas lawman would be printed in the Orlando Sentinel, and that's how some remember him still. A year after he destroyed Michael Morton's life, Boutwell took another. He was with a group of lawmen who'd responded to a call about a convenience store robbery. A man had been seen running for the nearby woods. The lawmen entered the area in pursuit. No one was around when Boutwell shot him. At least, that's what Boutwell's report says. But then it also says that the man reached with his right hand for his gun while fleeing. Tony Pena, the man who was killed, was left-handed. The report doesn't mention that the gun was found 5 feet from the body. It also doesn't mention that the gun was a toy. The report doesn't mention why officers broke protocol and loaded the body into a hearse before the Justice of the Peace, Judy Hobbs, arrived. They were surprised when she showed up. They hadn't bothered notifying her, but the EMS dispatcher had done so, as was required. Alarmed to discover the scene of the killing had been disturbed, Hobbs ordered an autopsy on the body. One was performed the next day by the Travis County medical examiner, Roberto Bayardo. According to Bayardo, neither of the bullets entered Pena's body at an angle indicative of Pena running away from Boutwell. Bayardo stated there was no evidence Pena was moving, running, or walking away from Boutwell when he was shot. In fact, Bayardo said it appeared that Pena was either lying on his stomach or kneeling down when he was shot. Boutwell killed him in cold blood, while he was kneeling or lying down. You'd think the county district attorney would be interested in that, wouldn't you? But it was still Ken Anderson, Boutwell's old friend, the one who'd helped him put Michael Morton behind bars. Anderson went through the motions, scheduled a grand jury to look into the case. He said it was the right thing to do, even though there was no reason to suspect any wrongdoing. Archie Montgomery was assigned by DPS to look into the shooting. Like Don Wood in the Michael Morton investigation, he spent most of his efforts talking to the victim's friends instead of looking for evidence. He reported that some of them recalled Pena saying he wouldn't make it till Sunday. It was speculated that Pena's death was a suicide by a cop. He'd wanted to die, according to that line of thought. He just didn't have the guts to pull the trigger. Montgomery's reports don't mention Bayardo's autopsy or the fact that no fingerprints had been found on the toy gun. Maybe it wouldn't have mattered. According to one grand juror who asked to remain anonymous, Anderson pushed for a specific outcome from the very beginning of the hearing. Anderson was reluctant to share the autopsy report and photographs of the body with the jury, the same juror said. Only after persistent appeals from the grand jury panel did Anderson provide Bayardo's autopsy conclusions. The grand jury no-billed Boutwell. He got away with murder. He was a legend, after all, bigger than life, and he did whatever he had to do to get his man. Michael Morton is out of prison now, but he'll never be completely free. He'll always bear the wounds Boutwell and Anderson have inflicted on him. He'll never get back those years, and he'll never raise his son. To this day, I wrestle with what might have been and what continues to be their motivations, Michael wrote. I still wonder why. Careerism, peer pressure, hubris, misplaced duty, a warped longing to get the bad guys. I don't know. I only know what they did. Hubris, yes, that's likely. Researchers have identified hubris as a characteristic that often accompanies the experience of success, a word they use in much the same way I used celebrity earlier. People who achieve great success or fame may develop oversized egos. They may start thinking they're above the rules. They may develop an exaggerated self-endorsement that leads to a lack of conscience. A need for praise and adulation, a pass on the rules, a lack of conscience. That's a perfect storm. It's easy to make light of Sheriff Jim Boutwell for his embrace of the lawman stereotype, but maybe he was doing what celebrities do, creating a false self as a way to emotionally survive the experience of his sudden fame. Perhaps that is a harder thing than most of us can imagine. What if he became addicted to fame after getting his first short taste of it in 1966 when he circled the tower where shooter Charles Whitman was crouched? That's what people do. And up until that point, he's always portrayed as being on the right side of the law. Afterward, he regularly crosses the line. It's as if he was blinded by his desire for publicity, the way Icarus was blinded by his desire to touch the sun. I'll leave the last word to Ashley D. Stevens, writing about Confession Killer for Salon.com. This is a story of a megalomaniac, a self-identified pathological liar who went to extreme, almost laughable lengths to keep the spotlight on him. And just to be clear, she's talking about Henry Lee Lucas.
So Meg puts together this really unique timeline where she can look at Otis Toole going all the way back, like his entire life. She has it laid out. Even times when he's kind of unaccounted for, we don't worry about those as much because we can see he's not really committing crimes. His crimes were petty, and the truth is, a lot of his crimes weren't even really crimes. A lot of what he was doing amounted to vagrancy. He was strange. He was cross-dressing. He was effeminate. He is a big dude. He's like my size. He's a very, very large dude, but he's effeminate, and he prefers the company of men. And that right there is his cardinal sin. So we look at Otis, we look at Henry, and Meg has gone to great detail she just wanted to make sure we weren't wrong with what we're going to say next. And when you're untangling something like the Adam Walsh case, often, in my experience, you're not looking for something that happened around the Adam Walsh case. And sure enough, this goes back years before that. One of the problems we have now that we can look at Otis and Henry, honestly, and Meg has agreed with me on this, I think. So on the one hand, you have the problem of these two are accused of being serial killers. They're not even murderers, barely. Henry has some stuff that might chalk itself up to death, like him causing death. But realistically, they're not murderers. They're petty criminals who are sort of arching their way up. Now, Otis is a bit of a firebug. Like, that's a thing. But he sort of goes out of his way to make sure no one gets hurt until 1983. And the odd thing about that is because he's got a reputation as a firebug, there's a cigarette on a mattress incident where Otis ends up getting accused of killing someone, but not at first. At first, it's just an arson. Guy dies of smoke inhalation. Jim Boutwell, he has Henry Lee Lucas in custody and is basically parading anyone with an open cold case through. And you can go and listen to this. You can listen to this on The Confession Killer. You can just go on YouTube and listen to anything about Henry Lee Lucas. The problem I have with Henry Lee Lucas is no one has ever bothered to correct the narrative. So Henry Lee Lucas didn't kill anyone, but these guys didn't kill anyone. They are not serial killers. Not only are they not serial killers, they're not murderers. Not in the sense of like killing someone on purpose. That's not what they've done. And the argument I come back to is I might be able to get them for some felony murders here and there. I definitely could take their words and use them against them. But these two guys, they are just trapped in the super cop problem. And what's interesting about it is the last time we talked about super cops, it was Ted Bundy. So this is an escalated version of super cops. It's after Bundy has been captured and the super cops start to flex their muscles. Well, this is the same thing. Everybody wants a serial killer. So this guy makes Henry Lee Lucas. This is the real making of a murderer right here, by the way. Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole being made into serial killers is one of the most fascinating things I've ever seen. And I would not have gone through all of this were I not trying to solve the murder of Adam Walsh. But it doesn't start there. Adam Walsh dies in 1981. The problems in this case extend from the mid-'70s till 1983. 1983 is where it all comes to a head. And when it starts out, it doesn't have anything to do with Adam Walsh. None of this does. They're trying to clear other murders in Florida and other murders on I-35. There are serial killers walking around today. That's the big problem I have with this. Serial killers that are still walking around and have never been caught because of some jackasses in Texas. And those jackasses made two murderers. They made these guys into murderers, and then they amplified them into serial killers. Now, the cool part is the balloon gets so big it pops, but the problem is nobody went back and picked up the pieces and actually made it all make sense. Those two never should have been in prison for anything serious. If you want to put Otis in for the arson fire, that's fine. I don't think it's an arson. It doesn't look like an arson. It looks like an accidental fire, and they just pinned it on it. Well, this guy, Buddy Terry, he is coming over from Florida to talk to Henry Lee Lucas. He says he left closing 8 cases with Henry Lee Lucas, and he goes back. Suddenly, Otis Toole's arson fire, where the gentleman that was in the house dying of smoke inhalation, it suddenly becomes a murder. And that gives us the psych evals for Otis. So they evaluate him in terms of the arson fire, and then they start like trying to pin Adam Walsh on him. And why this case was closed in 2008 as an exceptional clearance that Otis Toole did it is insane. This is like, I get so frustrated with all this because I don't know where to start. And I promise you, that's where other writers and other journalists and even other law enforcement, that's where they're stuck on these cases. Because you have to pick this apart going all the way back to Jim Boutwell. And if you could pick apart Jim Boutwell and the mistakes he made with Henry Lee Lucas, you could solve so many things going forward. But you have to untangle the cases they've closed on the backs of these guys. And those cases that they've closed have to be reopened, reexamined. And everybody has to realize that Otis and Henry didn't kill anybody. And I feel so strange, like being in this position. And I've looked at it when I started wanting to solve the case of Adam Walsh. I have most of the pieces of the Adam Walsh puzzle. It's not these guys. It has nothing to do with these guys. So when I start like tearing that apart, it's also not Jeffrey Dahmer. That's another thing that we ran into. Somebody's like, oh, it's Donald Leroy Evans or it's Jeffrey Dahmer. It's not them either. But untangling all of this web it's absolutely mind-boggling. It's almost impossible. You almost need a computer that you can feed these cases into just to spit out the bare bones facts so you can go back and look at them. But you have to reopen all of them, everything that they got attached to. And like I said, the bubble popped, and at that moment, law enforcement should have done it. But Jim Boutwell, like, he has a history of doing this, and it doesn't really intertwine. Like, so you get into this whole situation, Texas versus Florida, Florida versus Texas. The Adam Walsh case should have been enough to like trace back through Buddy Terry, and they do. They issue memos about Buddy Terry. They should trace back into Texas, and it had enough media gravitas that like someone should have got a hold of Jim Boutwell and shook him, and they should have like stopped all of this, but they didn't, and it gets worse. That's the crazy part about this with Jim Boutwell. So we get through all of this, and we start to see that some of the people that are more conspiracy minded, they have picked up on, because you know, conspiracy starts with they start with grains of truth. In this instance, they picked up on that Otis Toole cannot possibly have killed Adam Walsh. So one section of that runs with, well, maybe Adam Walsh isn't dead, which is its own insanity. And there's another faction that thinks Jeffrey Dahmer did it, which I always wondered, like, why, you know, how do the odds of Jeffrey Dahmer being there and this all happening, how does that work? But Meg had pointed out to me that I had missed like a major thing with Dahmer. So that's not the case. So we go through, and the first thing we realize that we have to do in the scope of all this is we have to go through what Jim Boutwell is like. Then we have to like find the edges of Buddy Terry's story. And then we have to focus in on Otis and Henry. And when we do that, what we really wanted to do was prove it conclusively so that we had a reason to just back that all out. And then we could say, okay, now that you guys can see these things weren't possible, we want to put together a new investigation into the death of Adam Walsh. And I'm choosing my words very carefully here because of what we discovered. But the death of Adam Walsh deserves the family deserves like real closure. And we've wondered, like, do they know? Because there's some hints along the way that maybe they're not. Maybe this was where they were susceptible to the media, and they just didn't want to stop the forward momentum of the resources and the things that had sort of become known in Adam's name. But they go as far as to accuse John Walsh of predator panic. So I say they, that's critics of John Walsh who have mouthpieces or sort of space in the media. So what we discovered about Adam Walsh's death is it's definitely solvable in 1981. It's probably solvable in 1983. Looking back on it now, we're getting into this 30-year mark. It's going to get complicated. And in Namath, there are some bits and pieces of children and teenagers that have been found down in that area where, like, someone comes across the phone. We think they're possibly Adam Walsh's remains in there. We can't swear to that. It would take a lot to like sort this out. But we think based on where his body probably ended up and how his death went, that there's a good chance that some pieces of Adam have some parts of Adam have been found.
2 years later, a two-bit arsonist behind bars for burning down a couple of buildings in Jacksonville, Florida, would drop a bombshell. He claimed he wanted to come clean about the murder of a little boy.
He made admissions that he had killed a young boy from the Fort Lauderdale area and killed him and took him and dumped his body. Very similar to what we believed happened with Adam.
What he recounted, the things he said he did, were enough to make even the most hardened cop's blood run cold.
In his words, Adam just came willingly with him to a certain point, to where he decided that he was safe to grab him without anyone seeing him and threw him in his car.
He said that July afternoon, he locked Adam inside his 1971 Cadillac and drove off towards his home in Jacksonville. Along the way, Adam started crying, so he punched him in the face. At some point, he pulled off the road, used a machete, and decapitated Adam. He said he drove around with Adam's head and eventually tossed it into a canal. Adam's head was found at mile marker 130. His body was never recovered. This little boy had no chance when faced with so deranged a killer as Otis Toole.
If he met anybody on the street, they'd be scared of him. He was a weird-looking individual. The way he carried himself, the way he looked, the way he communicated.
Toole wrote letters to the media and Disney World, boasting about his evil acts. The words are chilling. I'm the man who kidnapped, raped, murdered, and cut up Adam Walsh. I really love to rape and kill, and I'm awfully good at it. Maybe the best in the business. He even wrote Adam's father.
I read the letter and threw up in the bathroom when I was showed that letter. I mean, here's a guy that admitted to me in a letter that he had murdered my son. I have the letter.
He died in prison on September 15th, 1996.
Otis Toole deserved the horrible death that he got. He should have had a worse death, and I hope he burns in hell for the rest of his life.
On a summer day, Adam Walsh was taken and brutally murdered. That's all anyone can say for sure. Who killed Adam Walsh remains a mystery.
It's one of the most famous crimes in American history. In fact, it's been called the crime that changed America. Before the disappearance of 6-year-old Adam Walsh, there were no Amber Alerts or missing kids on milk cartons. But during the decades the case went unsolved, Adam's father, John Walsh, got famous for hunting down bad guys on America's Most Wanted. Adam's mother has been largely silent until tonight.
This is America's Most Wanted.
On his show, America's Most Wanted, John Walsh has helped capture more than 1,000 criminals.
Next time I see Alan White's face, I want to see bars in front of him.
But unbelievably, for decades, the one case he couldn't crack was the murder of his own son. Until several years ago, when his wife, Reve, said she had had enough.
I can't go to my grave not doing everything that I can possibly do. And I said, we're going to get a cold case detective, and we're going to start from the beginning. I don't care if you go to work just to pay the bill of this private investigator, but we're going to get somebody.
It has been 30 years since Adam Walsh was abducted in America's most famous case of a missing child. During that time, Reve has largely stood by silently while her husband held the spotlight. But in this rare interview, she tells her story, the story of one mother's quiet, fierce determination.
Do you remember the last thing that he said to you?
Sure. I said, I'm going right over here to the lamp department. And he said, okay, Mommy, I know where that is.
With no thought in your mind that that was the last conversation?
No.
Adam was abducted from outside a suburban shopping mall on July 27, 1981. 2 agonizing weeks later, John got the news that Adam's severed head had been found floating in a canal.
I got that call. And they said, we got to find your wife, and we got to tell her. And I said, you know what? I'll tell her. I'll be the one to tell her. Toughest thing I've ever done.
When all this was going on, and I just thought to myself, God, I can't wait, till it's 20 years or 25 years from now. I don't care about getting old. I just want this experience in my life to be that far away from me, because I thought it would be, different, but it's really not.
I don't know who would do this to a 6-year-old child. I can't conceive of it.
The horror of losing a child was made worse, say the Walshes, by their bitter disappointment with the local police in Hollywood, Florida, who they believe botched the murder investigation.
Little did we know that nothing was being done.
One nightmare after another.
There was even a prime suspect, this man, Ottis Toole, an admitted serial killer who was already in prison.
You done killed one and you can't kill it and kill it. It gets easier and easier, and it don't really bother you.
Toole made 24 documented confessions to killing Adam Walsh, including during this 1984 interview with the Texas Rangers.
Have you ever wished you hadn't killed someone?
Well, I kind of feel bad about Adam Walsh killing.
That's the only person you've ever killed that you feel bad about?
That's the youngest child I ever killed. He's only 6 years old.
But even this confession was not enough for the Hollywood Police Department to push to file charges. And so after the case sat idle for roughly 1/4 of a century, Reve urged John to hire a cold case investigator. This man, Joe Matthews, a retired police detective.
So you look at the markers.
Matthews went back and painstakingly pored over every one of the 10,000 pages in the case file, reporting back almost daily to Reve. Matthews concluded that the lead detective on the Walsh case, a man named Jack Hoffman, had become convinced, despite compelling evidence, that Ottis Toole didn't do it.
So Ottis Toole confesses to this crime repeatedly, knows things about the crime that only the police knew, yet the lead investigator, Detective Hoffman, doesn't believe him. Why not?
Ego was involved in tunnel vision. And the tunnel vision is you come up with your own hypotheses as to what took place, and you work that case to validate your own hypotheses.
After combing through the case file, Matthews made a major discovery, a roll of film from the crime scene of Ottis Toole's car, film that the original detectives never even bothered to have developed. The film contained what Matthews considered to be a monumental revelation.
How long did it take for you to realize what you had here?
Within seconds when I was going through the photos.
On the rear floorboard of the car, where Toole had admitted to tossing Adam's severed head, the outline of a face with the darkened eye sockets and open mouth.
You actually see his image, and it's as clear as the, Shroud of Turin.
To me, it was the one thing that a mother knows, is that this is their child. This picture is their child.
In 2008, based on these new pictures and a mountain of other evidence that Detective Matthews finally pulled together in a way that the original detectives had failed to do, the new Hollywood Police Department chief officially closed the case, definitively naming Ottis Toole, who by this time had died in prison, as the man who killed Adam Walsh.
If Ottis Toole was alive today, he would be arrested for the abduction and murder of Adam Walsh on July 27th, 1981.
Listening to the words that came off of Chief Wagner's lips just penetrate my soul.
It took Detective Matthews, working with the Walshes, just 2.5 years to do what the Hollywood Police Department could not do over the course of decades. Today, John and Reve are still living in Florida, where they have a horse farm and 3 children, all born after Adam, who would now be 36 years old.
Come on, baby doll. Yes, yes. Nothing's going to bring Adam back. Nothing's going to bring him back. So the most we could hope for was to have peace, knowing that We know what happened, we know the end result, and the puzzle is finished.
For Nightline, this is Dan Harris.
No matter how you shake it, because of Jim Boutwell and Henry Lee Lucas, we get Otis Toole. If you want to see the stretch of that, this stuff starts in 1983 with Boutwell and Lucas, right? Otis Toole's case is exceptionally clear in December of 2008. So for 25 years, that reach has continued. That celebrity on both sides, the criminal and the super cops, has continued. But if you take a hard look at Otis Toole, not only will you question why John Walsh cleared him, you'll question why the circle around John Walsh allowed this to happen at all, particularly when you consider how close he is with law enforcement all the way up to the FBI, including like the Department of Justice. It's a travesty that this was allowed to happen to the name of Adam Walsh. What you get here is a Godzilla-sized problem. It's huge. So I realized in researching the Adam Walsh case and how I get all the way over here into Texas, all the way to the west, is you need an Ultraman to battle Godzilla. You need, like, Godzilla versus Kong happens for a reason. You have to have an ego and a reputation as big as these other egos and these reputations in order to battle it. Even if, like, the people have long passed away, because a lot of the people that we're talking about here, Jim Boutwell, Jim Adams, you know, these people that pass away with these legacies, they can only be battled by other egos the same size as them. That's why Godzilla versus Kong is so interesting to people, because there's no human that can take on Godzilla. There's no normal podcaster that can go and take on the Jim Boutwells of the world. And we're not trying to take on John Walsh. That's not what we're doing. But we do have to point it all out, because that's the guy you recruit to be your Kong or your Ultraman. He has the actual good guy thing that's built up. But he's got to have a tragic flaw. He's got to have a backstory where he's done something. And in this case, Adam Walsh and how Adam Walsh's case went down ultimately is John Walsh's tragic flaw, not just the tragedy itself, but how it all played out. Thanks for joining us. You can reach us at 252-365-5593 or at truecrimexcess.com or truecrimexcess@gmail.com if you want to send us a note. This episode was brought to you by LabrottieCreations.com. That's LABROTTIECREATIONS.com. Check out the merchandise and specifically their fun Pop Pet art custom pieces made from photos of your very own pets. Use the promo code CRIMEXS, that's CRIMEXS, for 20% off a fun, brightly colored, happy piece of art of your own pet at their site, LabrottieCreations.com. Music in this episode was licensed for True Crime XS. The theme song was Indestructible by Noah Smith. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform or at TeePublic, Instagram, or Twitter. You can also join us on Patreon to fund future body exploration trips. But the best thing you can do for us is leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform and share us with your friends. And we'll see you next time.
This is True Crime XS.
A family tragedy in Lancaster. 2 children found decapitated inside their home, and their father is under arrest. Firefighters had initially responded to reports of a possible gas leak at this home on Century Circle. Then they stumbled on the horrific scene. They immediately called sheriff's deputies and paramedics, who removed the bodies of a 12-year-old boy and a 13-year-old girl.
One appears to be a male. One appears to be a female, possibly suffering from some type of a sharp trauma. It doesn't seem to be that the cause of death from the 2 people inside have anything to do with the gas leak.
Deputies arrested the children's father, 34-year-old Maurice Taylor, on suspicion of murdering both children. Taylor, along with an adult woman and 2 other children, were found inside the home and interviewed by homicide detectives. He's being held now on $2 million bail.
So when you get into decapitations, you're going to find that that's generally a family affair, a punishment, or it's done in the home. And decapitations are very, very rare. You can find, you can dig through and you might find the case of some children being decapitated by strangers, but it is exceedingly rare. And it doesn't fit with your Otis Tools and your Henry Lee Lucases, because primarily what you'll find is that it's a parent or a substitute parent or some other relative, or that it's someone one of those people owe money to. That is where, in the United States, that is where you will find when decapitations happen.
You wouldn't want somebody to do to you. Follow the golden rule, and we won't have no problems. Hey.